Morning and welcome back. Before I introduce our speaker for this morning's session, I'd like to take a moment to congratulate Jamie and the Abbot for hosting such an event as this. The Catholic intellectual life has a rich history, and we hope a vital present and future. I wonder how helpful the question mark at the end of the conference title really is. What does the question mark mean? For much of his critical afterlife, this has been a non-issue. He was a member of the C of E, period. I think the revisionist historical work in the last several decades has opened up new questions that have long been ignored. For centuries, he's been considered the house poet of Reformed England, as if Reformed England was a neatly completed work and simply done by the time Shakespeare arrives and makes his mark on the London theater scene. We are now reminded by this scholarly work that this is a much more complex issue, not only in terms of biography, but in terms of literary criticism. Such assignations often reveal more about the critic than the works themselves: Shakespeare the capitalist, the monarchist, the nihilist, the sexist. But to our purpose, is calling Shakespeare a Catholic an act of pigeonholing him? Biographically, this question is mysterious and perhaps even unknowable. The more interesting and I think fruitful endeavor is to sketch out the worldview presented to us through the plays. Shakespeare offers us a vision of the world that is, in the end, enchanted. His world is complex, bitter, happy, melancholic and confusing, alienating and life-affirming. His character sketches are seemingly human inventing, as Bloom argues. The Catholic intellectual life must be large enough, generous enough, critical enough to include and examine everything. Few poets dare what Shakespeare has dared. He is a model for us. And speaking of models, I'd like to introduce to you Glenn Arbery, Dalton Professor of Liberal Education, Assumption College, Worcester, Massachusetts. Writer, teacher, husband, father, and Southerner. Now, how does a Southern boy from Georgia wind up in Worcester? Glenn has written on a variety of subjects, from his dissertation on women in Shakespeare to his work on Homer, Faulkner, Dostoevsky, Dante, Flannery O'Connor, lyric poetry, and Southern criticism, just to mention a few. Informing all his work is the idea that literature matters, the title of one of his books. It matters because literature is a mode of truth. Literature is not a sideshow of rhetorical whimsy and wittiness, but rather it gets at the heart of the human condition. It can be true, like Aristotle or Thomas is true. What a strange and wonderful thing is the web of grace. Glenn and I first crossed paths in a barn in New Hampshire. How I, a Southern boy from Louisiana, got there, I do not know. How he got there, he probably doesn't know either. But what I learned from him is hard to calculate and quantify. His humanities classes at Thomas More College are legendary amongst his students. In fact, I still mark the day, this is a true story, October 4th, 1993, is a turning point in my own life. His class on the battle between Hector and Patroclus, watched by Achilles, opened me to a profound complexities and the beauty of the mundus imaginalis. I floated out of class that day, and I've been chasing this terrain of the imagination ever since. On my best days in the classroom, I could only hope that I was Glenn-like and call it a day. Not to be too cheesy, but I learned from Glenn that these encounters actually can change your life. At any rate, Glenn has been a great teacher, mentor, and friend. He taught me to love literature, that something momentous happens in these great works that call us to bear witness to that which is true. His passion, though gentle seeming, is robust and infectious. I only regret we only have him today for a few minutes instead of a whole semester. Ladies and gentlemen, the title of his talk, The Problem of Catholic Piety in the Henry VI Plays. Glenn Arbery. Well, okay.
say anything after that, but I really appreciate that introduction. Several weeks ago, at my son's graduation from college, I met a politics professor of his who said he would be teaching a course on tyranny in the fall. Among the texts he mentioned was Shakespeare's Richard III. He said that he was taking a different tack with it. Richard himself, he told me, was a kind of caricature of the Machiavellian villain, an overblown figure out of a weird medieval world that he found it impossible to take seriously. The real Machiavelli was Richmond, who understood how to seem convincingly religious, whereas no one would ever believe any display of Richard's piety. The Henry VI plays were already on my mind, and his opinion about the weirdness of Richard made me wonder if he had read the earlier plays of the tetralogy. If he thought the character of Richard was overwrought, what about the demonic Joan of Arc in Henry VI Part 1? Or the ruffian Jack Cade in Part 2, who claims to be the heir to the throne through the Mortimer line, and who shouts to his illiterate followers, "My mouth shall be the Parliament of England." What about Clifford and Margaret, who sop a handkerchief with the blood of York's murdered young son Rutland and taunt York with it before they stab him to death? When I gingerly asked the professor if he had read the Henry VI plays, he admitted he had not. He looked mildly embarrassed, but only mildly. His presumption, widely shared, is that it's legitimate to interpret Richard III without even reading the plays that preceded, even though Richard figures prominently in both the second and third parts of the first tetralogy. The Henry VI plays tend to scare away readers because of their critical reputation as early efforts of Shakespeare's, often suspected of being written in part by other hands, especially the first one. Why should anyone who admires the sublimities of King Lear in The Winter's Tale submit to the disillusionment of reading his apprentice efforts before he became the poet we know? There are some passages in there that really make you wince a little. Talbot and his son, to me, go on a little too long. Besides, Henry VI himself has the reputation of being the dithering, pious weakling who lost everything his great father won in France. And there are 3 plays about him. It seems an extravagant expenditure of effort on an unpromising subject matter, despite the War of the Roses raging around him. For many readers, Shakespeare as a writer of history plays first emerges with Richard III. But without the Henry VI plays, Richard III necessarily has the same severely abridged interpretive framework that Henry V would have without Richard II and Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. I want to second what a critic named Homer Swander wrote in an essay on a groundbreaking Royal Shakespeare Company production of the uncut Henry VI plays in 1977 and 78. As the trilogy ends, everything that has served the unity of the plays creates a powerful drive toward Part 4, Richard III, invoking it in our minds and drastically altering any view we may have of it as a play standing on its own, as Shakespeare's first successful history play. The Henry VI plays are important in their own right, but they also form their coherence, giving the 50-year mare's nest of English history they dramatize on the character of Henry VI, perhaps the most unambiguously religious and un-Machiavellian Catholic in Shakespeare's canon. I think you can think of other characters, you propose characters who are Catholic in Shakespeare, certainly Friar Lawrence, right, the Duke in Measure for Measure, and so on. But is there anybody in Shakespeare's canon who is unambiguously religious and not plotting, not scheming in the same way that Henry VI is? He's the one character whose action, including the fact of his death, most ties together all four parts on a symbolic level. At the beginning of Henry VI, Part 1, he's an infant who becomes king and inherits the enormous administrative problem of France when his famous father dies. In the middle plays, he's the pious man, an ineffectual peacemaker, fooled in his marriage, weakened in the eyes of others by his indifference to France, and conscience-stricken about his title to the throne. Well before the end of the trilogy, he's deposed, but Shakespeare doesn't entitle the third play Edward IV. He ends it with the symbolic gravity of Henry's death and the peculiar levity of Edward's court as Richard, Duke of Gloucester, lays down his plots. Henry's symbolism carries over into Richard III, where he appears as the sacred corpse whose wounds miraculously bleed in Richard's presence. The misfortune and the profundity of Henry VI, as Shakespeare presents him, have a great deal to say about the settlement with Catholicism, so to speak, that he makes as a dramatist. There were obvious reasons that a playwright in England, in Elizabethan England, couldn't declare his Catholicism unambiguously. But in the Henry VI plays, we face certain problems that might suggest actual hostility to it. At the very least, they require interpretation. Peter Milward in Shakespeare the Papist mentions the shocking treatment of Joan of Arc, the contempt of the admirable Duke of Gloucester for John Beaufort, first Bishop and later Cardinal of Winchester, Margaret's scornful inventory of Henry's pieties, and the exposure of the false miracle. What I call the problem of Catholicism in the Henry VI plays stems from the ambiguities surrounding Henry, ambiguities that reveal Shakespeare investigating what happens to the traditional Catholicism of England when legitimacy is in question and the realm is overwhelmed by political ambition, not only in politics but also within the church. By traditional Catholicism, I mean not doctrine alone, but the practice of a society, in Donald Davidson's words, stable, religious, more rural than urban, and politically conservative. A description that typified most of England before Henry VIII. It's to be distinguished from ecclesiastical politics and the all too worldly dimensions excoriated by Dante. What evidence is there, for better or for worse, that Henry VI is unambiguously a traditional Catholic? His authentic attempt to act as a mere Christian, in C.S. Lewis's sense, is remarkable enough in itself. For example, his first words in the trilogy are an attempt to reconcile his uncles of Gloucester and Winchester. I would prevail, if prayers might prevail, to join your hearts in love and amity. He acts the role of a peacemaker repeatedly, in fact. In commenting later in the same play on the proposed truce with France, he tells Gloucester, I always thought it was both impious and unnatural that such humanity and bloody strife should reign among professors of one faith. In the next play, he refuses to judge the soul of Winchester, despite his horrendous death. If you remember the death of Winchester, it's horrible, right? They're asking him if he has any repentance, and no sign comes, and so on. It's a terrible death. He genuinely regrets the death of York, his worst enemy, when he sees his head, above the gate. He regrets the whole thing. He witnesses with grief the dire effects of civil war, the father killing his son, and the son the father. But the specifics that make him particularly identifiable with the old faith come from the woman he marries, Margaret of Anjou. In a speech not long after her marriage to Henry, she accuses Suffolk of misleading her. Remember, Suffolk has been the go-between in all this. I'll come back to Suffolk. Is this the government of Britain's Isle, and this the royalty of Albion's king? What, shall King Henry be a pupil still under the surly Gloucester's governance? Am I a queen in title and in style, and must be made a subject to a duke? I tell thee, Pole, when in the city tours thou ranst a tilt in honor of my love, and stolest away the ladies' hearts of France, I thought King Henry had resembled thee in courage, courtship, and proportion. But all his mind is bent to holiness, to number Ave Marys on his beads. His champions are the prophets and apostles, his weapons holy saws of sacred writ. His study is his tilt yard, and his loves are brazen images of canonized saints. I would the College of the Cardinals would choose him Pope and carry him to Rome and set the triple crown upon his head. That were a state fit for his holiness. Margaret's speech establishes Henry as not only of the old faith, but ardently so. All his mind is bent to holiness, and his practices include many specifically rejected in the 39 articles established under Elizabeth. Article 22, I remind you, reads, "The Romish doctrine concerning purgatory, pardons, worshiping, and adoration as well of images as of relics, and also invocation of saints, is a fine thing vainly invented and grounded upon no warranty of Scripture, but rather repugnant to the Word of God." Henry's loves are brazen images of canonized saints. This description is so unambiguous that Shakespeare could not escape censure if Henry seemed praiseworthy. Margaret's unmistakable preference for the knightly, spirited Suffolk and her tone of contempt for her milquetoast bookworm of a Catholic husband seemed calculated on Shakespeare's part to convince the audience of Henry's complete unworthiness to be an English king. What do bully English kings or queens have to do with popes or with the old faith? If we were being cynical about Shakespeare's view of religion, we could say he can get away with criticizing Christianity per se by making it Catholic. But I don't think we need to be that cynical. Now, on the other hand, Margaret establishes herself as so thoroughly toxic that her scorn, I think of Goneril scorn for Albany, might be the best evidence for Henry's worthiness. Shakespeare uses the word holiness only 13 times in his complete works, most often as a title, His Holiness, to describe the Pope. And 2 of those 13 uses come in this speech by Margaret. What exactly is Margaret saying to Suffolk? Not that Henry should be a monk or a priest, but that he should be Pope, a state fit for his holiness. It's a complicated thing to tell to her lover Suffolk, for lover he certainly is. She's mocking Henry for being more Catholic than the Pope, but she's also saying, with a certain wifely pride, that he may not be much of a king, but he's at least remarkable. The church would do well to elect him Pope. And somewhere down in her mockery, she's also admitting to Suffolk that much as she might find his piety distasteful, much as she prefers her man of action, Henry has an undeniable spiritual importance. But if Henry's such a good Catholic, we may well ask, what is he doing marrying Margaret in the first place? He falls in love with her entirely from Suffolk's description. And Suffolk can praise her convincingly because he's in love with her himself. He tells Henry that his words still fall short and that her perfections, if he had sufficient skill to utter them, would make a volume of enticing lines able to ravish any dull conceit. He paints a Margaret not only beautiful, but possessing humble lowliness of mind and willing to obey Henry's virtuous, chaste intents. More might be said, but what comes from this scene, unfortunately or not, is an impression of young Henry as inexperienced and credulous, just as easily manipulated as Suffolk imagined when he first wooed Margaret for his own ends. His credulity tends to offset the impression of his spiritual weight. Not only does Henry break off a politically advantageous engagement with the daughter of the Earl of Armagnac to marry Margaret, but he gives Suffolk the right to gather the 10th part of their produce or profits from the people, an exorbitant tax, just for Suffolk's expenses in bringing her to England. At the beginning of Henry VI, Part 2, the full dimensions of the bargain become clear. The court learns that at Suffolk's urging, Henry has agreed to give Maine and Anjou back to the French as part of the marriage agreement. Maine and Anjou, Warwick cries. Myself did win them both. The loss of these lands, for which English soldiers had fought and died, is offset by nothing except the person of Margaret herself, since she brings no dowry to enrich the English treasury. In fact, she brings Henry less than nothing. She makes him a cuckold, while Henry ignorantly makes Suffolk a duke with great power at the court and in Parliament. Now, to say the least, Henry's traditional Catholicism cannot hold its own in the Machiavellian world of court power. His faith has the strength of its sincerity, but even with Gloucester as his protector, he can be swayed by a man like Suffolk. And when Gloucester himself falls victim to the schemes of others, Henry has no chance. Let me put Henry's entanglement with Margaret in a larger Catholic context. I've mentioned Shakespeare's Joan of Arc, and certainly I'm tempted to accept the suggestion of the commentator in 1917 who confidently ascribed the outrageous treatment of Joan at the end of Henry VI, Part 1 to the revisions of Robert Greene. That would be nice. But there the demonic Joan stands from the time of the First Folio, and what makes her hard to dismiss is her juxtaposition to Margaret. Before the Battle of Angers, Joan of Arc invokes the fiends or familiar spirits who supply her with aid. This is a shock, right? We've seen Joan early on sounding like the Joan we know, but here at the end of the play, there's this revelation that she's actually invoking the fiends. But now, before this last battle, they turn aside and abandon her, even though she offers them blood sacrifice. She offers to lop off one of her limbs. And then, when that doesn't work, she says, then take my soul, my body, soul and all, before that England give the French the foil. She gives up her soul for France. In other words, she's a figure of such intense nationalism, such an intensity of identification with France that she gives up her own soul for it. Now, the fiends offer her no help, but they might take her up on her offer, since the following plays detail the loss of France, if you follow me, and if there's some connection there with John. Margaret of Anjou first appears in the very next scene, which balances the first fresh appearance of Joan early in the play. Suffolk, smitten with her, woos her clearly for himself. But since he's already married, which he remembers inconveniently enough, he conceives the idea of marrying her to the young Henry VI instead, and gaining power over the king through her. The very next scene is Joan's final one in the play, and it's an ugly scene indeed. I don't even want to get into it. You know, I won't get into it. But immediately following it is the scene in which Suffolk overwhelms Henry with praise of Margaret of Anjou. So you get these scenes right next to each other, Joan and Margaret. Whatever one speculates about the grotesquely slanderous depiction of Joan, it's important to see that Shakespeare, and no one but Shakespeare, closely juxtaposes her to Margaret, who remains a crucial character all the way into Richard III. Even from the outset, Margaret seems to embody Joan's curse. She damages the English as much as Joan ever did on the battlefield. When Henry gives Maine and Anjou back to France as part of her wedding settlement, it is as though Margaret had replaced Joan to give French interests, not to say Joan's fiends, a new foothold in the bosom of the English court. Margaret's marriage to Henry undercuts him in every way, especially since she appears to couple him before she ever meets him. When Suffolk announces at the beginning of part 2 that he has married Margaret as Henry's proxy, it's one of those shocking speeches to read. It was a medieval custom, that you could send someone to marry somebody by proxy. But when Suffolk does it, it has this sort of undertone that makes you queasy. I'm afraid his speech is laced with the irony of being literal. Henry's genuine Catholic piety, in other words, seems to play directly into Suffolk's most Machiavellian hands. Nevertheless, his holiness continues to shine through, however ambiguously. He's a man whom God has given the title everyone else covets, but who doesn't want it himself. According to his early biographer and confessor, John Blackman, the historical Henry avoided the trappings of kingship whenever he could, and when custom demanded that he wear the crown, say on festival days, he atoned with a hair shirt next to his skin. Shakespeare gives us a portrait of a reluctant prince who prefers his study to his throne. The spirited York dismisses Henry as bookish, and in this respect, Henry anticipates other such figures later in the Shakespeare canon. Hamlet, for instance, and certainly Prospero, who lost his own dukedom by neglecting worldly ends, all dedicated to closeness and the bettering of my mind. Especially under the years of Gloucester's protectorate, Henry can pursue his studies freely, since his protector proves himself to be a man of loyalty and genuine political integrity. But here another troubling matter arises in assessing Shakespeare's relation to Catholicism. The issue goes back to the very beginning of the first play of the trilogy, where Gloucester establishes himself as a kind of skeptic when it comes to the relation between effective kingship and the church. Gloucester's greatest enemy at court, at least until Margaret arrives, is Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, who was the illegitimate son, if y'all remember the genealogies, he's the illegitimate son of John of Gaunt, who had his mistress, Margaret Swinford, right, but then later married her, and the children were later legitimate, so on. But he was born illegitimate, and he's now not only a powerful clergyman, but a member of the royal house. As his relatives mourn for the dead Henry V in the opening lines of Act 1, this is the first play, Winchester says, "The battles of the Lord of hosts he fought, the church's prayers made him so prosperous." And Gloucester reacts with violent scorn. The church? Where is it? Had not churchmen prayed, his thread of life had not so soon decayed. None do you like but an effeminate prince, whom like a schoolboy you may overawe. Now, from the perspective of the later plays, or simply from Henry VI's reputation, Shakespeare certainly intends the irony to be felt, because the infant king grows up to be exactly the kind of prince that Gloucester dreads. Remember, Margaret calls him a pupil still under the surly Gloucester's governance. Well, it's not the church's governance, it doesn't seem, at least. At least. See where I'm going. Winchester, in turn, accuses Gloucester of wanting to command the prince and realm as protector. And Bedford breaks up the argument, but not before Gloucester snaps, "Name not religion, for thou lovest the flesh, and ne'er throughout the year to church thou goest, except it be to pray against thy foes." So, the only reason Winchester shows up at Mass is so he can pray against his enemies. Gloucester seems to have an anti-clerical reflex that's focused on Winchester. Perhaps he doesn't scorn religion per se, as Margaret seems to do. But he clearly thinks that the church is out of bounds when it meddles with politics. Gloucester means to stop Winchester despite his office. He tells him he's going to tug him by his beard, that he'll stamp the bishop's mitre under his feet, in spite of pope or dignities of church. I mean, they're strong lines. And his savage indication obviously overrides any kind of deference respect for the church. When Winchester says Gloucester will answer this insult before the pope, Gloucester answers, "Winchester goose," I cry, "a robe, a robe." The Winchester goose was slang for venereal disease, and it's an allusion to the historical fact that Beaufort, as Cardinal of Winchester, received revenues from brothels licensed in Southern. A rogue was an expression of derision, suggesting that Beaufort deserved hanging. Now, his suspicions about the vices of this bishop are amply borne out in the first two parts of the tetralogy. Later in Henry VI, Part 1, Winchester has just been named the cardinal, stops the papal legate, keeps him from leaving after he's had an audience with Henry VI, and tells him, you shall, before you go, right, you shall first receive the sum of money which I promised you should be delivered to His Holiness for clothing me in these grave ornaments. Not only does he buy his office, a purchase that also puts His Holiness the Pope in an unflattering light, but he intends to use his new office to make his political power equal to Gloucester's. For that reason, it's difficult to take Gloucester's criticisms of Beaufort as a slander on traditional Catholicism per se, if you see the distinction. The Cardinal of Winchester hides behind dignities of church and ecclesiastical politics for his most worldly ends. Gloucester is no more irreligious in criticizing him than Dante is, who doesn't hesitate to criticize popes if they sell church offices. In fact, he shows them being wedged upside down in hell, if you recall. Like Dante, Gloucester knows that the offices themselves deserve respect, as he tells Winchester, thou art reverent touching thy spiritual function, not thy life. He repeatedly demonstrates his own gruff but admirable integrity. He and Henry have a fundamental complementarity, so much so that it's possible to see in Gloucester a dimension of character that Henry has not assumed for himself. He has not had to assume it. Because he's had Gloucester, Henry can be the man of holiness, the peacemaker, who prefers to withdraw from the world of strife. And Gloucester can be the forceful man of integrity in the world of politics, the one almost as helpless as Henry, it turns out, against the increasingly subtle wiles, not to say Machiavellian tactics, of men and women who put worldly power above any other consideration. Now, unfortunately, Henry needs a protector, and perhaps his reliance on Gloucester undercuts the development of his own prudence. As this manipulation by Suffolk shows, he lacks political understanding, and he can be easily swayed by appeals to his pity or his piety. And the most striking of these appeals, another instance in which Shakespeare's attitude toward Catholicism seems to be in question. A townsman of St. Albans confronts Henry, claiming that a miracle has taken place. A blind man at St. Albans shrine, within this half hour, hath received his sight, a man that ne'er saw in his life before. Henry's first response, even before the man has been presented to him by the mayor of St. Albans, is to rejoice. Now God be praised that to believing souls gives light in darkness, comfort in despair. In the ensuing scene, however, Gloucester questions the man closely. Within a few exchanges, unravels the man's story. He asks him, what color's my gown? And the man says, her blood's red. What about his gown? Why, it's black. You've been blind since birth? Or I guess anyway, he exposes him pretty quickly. And when Gloucester also does the same thing with his lameness, he threatens him with lashing, and as soon as the guy feels the first lash of the whip, he runs away. And Henry is heartsick. He says, "Oh God, seest thou this, and bearest so long?" And Margaret's rejoinder, clearly meant as a rebuke, it made me laugh to see the villain run. Don't you think that's funny that this guy was pretending this? And the others in attendance, even the cardinal, which is Winchester, seem inured to this kind of deception. They jokingly ascribe a miracle to Gloucester since he's made the lame walk. Only Henry, who's exposed as believing and therefore is credulous, remains shaken by this fraud. As Peter Millward points out, this exposure of a false miracle appears to underscore Protestant claims about the various shrines of traditional English Catholicism. But the story is first told in St. Thomas More, a dialogue concerning heretics, an argument against the Protestant William Tyndale. More argues that the exposure of false miracles speaks well of the validity of true ones, a point that we should remember in a minute. The Protestant John Fox, however, also retells the story in his Acts and Monuments, so you can't say, right, definitely that Shakespeare is drawn on a Catholic source, as usual. But the effect on stage, I think, is to highlight Henry's goodness, though it's a credulous goodness. It's easy to dwell on Henry's failures. I'm going to do so for another minute at least. As a king, the man is a disaster. He fails Gloucester when his protector most needs protection. His only forceful act as king is his banishment of Suffolk, whom he suspects of killing Gloucester and coupling him. But the ensuing deaths of Suffolk and Winchester do not remove his problems so much as they clear the way for Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, right, who is the forceful figure in the middle parts of the trilogy. And on this point, when York wins the Battle of St. Albans and comes back to Parliament and is seated on the throne, Henry bargains with him and makes this kind of terrible concession. He says, "Let me, for this my lifetime, reign as king." He doubts his own title. He makes it very clear that he's not sure that through his grandfather he has a legitimate claim to the throne. Now, historically, Parliament made this suggestion, and Holinshed doesn't even seem to be ambiguous on it, but Shakespeare has it come directly from Henry. York agrees on the condition that the crown will then go to him and to his heir, and Henry replies, "I am content. Richard Plantagenet, enjoy the kingdom after my decease." Henry's own strongest supporters at this point turn away from him in disgust. Clifford exclaims, "What wrong is this unto the prince, your son?" Indeed. On the other hand, there's ample reason for Henry to doubt, as we've seen, that Margaret's son Edward is in fact Henry's son at all. But Edward is definitely Margaret's son, and she's so incensed that she decides to lead an army against York herself. A military turn that it seems to me seals her thematic connection to Joan of Arc, and that might have some bearing on another prominent woman, Elizabeth, in a traditionally male role, but that's just maybe a red herring. Despite Margaret's early victories, York's son defeat Margaret and Clifford at Towton, and during the crucial battle, Henry wanders off by himself. Margaret and Clifford have told him the troops will fight better without him. All right, but just here, when he's at his most ineffectual and ridiculous in a lot of ways, he begins to assume his real importance. He has a long meditation and is pastoral, interestingly. The whole scene is pastoral, about what a happy life it would be if he were an ordinary shepherd, no better than a homely swain. Despite the pastoral escapism and the horrendous context of civil war, it seems to be Henry's truest note, and I have no doubt that it can be played to telling effect. What a life were this, how sweet, how lovely, Henry declares. The absurdity of vying for the crown takes on a new aspect. And strangely, this very commentary also, it seems to me, begins to speak to the condition of the traditional church in England, beset by the demands of politics. And especially, I think, if you bear in mind this way that pastoral bears these sorts of allegorical meaning. Henry says, "It gives not the hawthorn bush a sweeter shade to shepherds looking on their silly sheep than doth a rich embroidered canopy to kings that fear their subjects' treachery." The shepherds, if you're disposed to this reading, right? Shepherds, of course, are pastors. The silly sheep, they're congregations. Biblically charged images of shepherd and sheep surround Henry, as we'll see again in a moment. The most famous hawthorn bush was at Glastonbury, site of the famous abbey, where the hawthorn was supposed to have sprung from the staff of Joseph of Arimathea. Now, isn't this traditional tree Not to mention the traditional stories, pilgrimages, and pieties associated with it. A sweeter shade than the king's embroidered canopy. This may be a wishful reading. Follow me? But it's one that is at least possible given the allegorical charge here. And also our awareness of secret outdoor masses, right? Of things that are taking place, perhaps under hawthorn trees. In any case, it's unquestionably on Henry's part, and arguably on Shakespeare's, a longing for this kind of pastoral life of traditional devotion. It doesn't feel coincidental that an extended meditation on hours immediately precedes it. And it also doesn't feel coincidental that this meditation is followed by scenes of the horrors of civil war. No one else in the world of these plays has the kind of sorrowful perspective, both inside and outside of these events, that Henry has. Now, one more thing. The battle lost, he flees to Scotland. And from Scotland, he steals into the north of England. In power, Henry always seems hapless and embarrassing, especially when events put him back on the throne again, and when he promptly gives it away to Warwick and Clarence. Out of power, on the other hand, he takes on a bittersweet melancholy, as though he could be at home in the forest of Arden, passing the time with Jakes. But his prophetic authority also gives him a belated gravitas. Secretly and dangerously re-entering England, he appears on stage with a prayer book. Now think about the figures you're looking at here. Someone illegally, secretly, coming back into England holding a prayer book. What does it call to mind? The similarity to a returning Catholic priest, right? Someone coming back from abroad, seems hard to avoid as a sort of figure of the imagination. Two hunters, overhearing his soliloquy, guess his identity. They capture him in a scene reminiscent of the capture of fugitive priests. And when they claim to be bound to Edward by oath, Henry questions them about the oath they took to him when he was king. But if thou be a king, one of them asks, where is thy crown? Henry answers, my crown is in my heart, not on my head, not decked with diamonds and Indian stones, nor to be seen. My crown is called content, a crown it is that seldom kings enjoy. The word content, of course, echoes what he says in making York his heir, I am content. But it also suggests his submission to God's will, an attunement of his ambitions to the nature of his circumstances, and an inner self-rule. It appears to signify his holiness, to come back to Margaret's word. It anticipates, by contrast, the opening line of Richard III, when Richard speaks, ironically, of the winter of our discontent, right? As Henry tells his captors, though the subtleties no doubt escaped him, in God's name, lead, your king's name be obeyed, and what God will, let that your king perform, and what he will, I humbly yield unto. Thomas More, I'm not sure his captors understand those lines, but Thomas More might have said the same thing, with the same distinction between God's will and the king's, right? That is, he'll follow the king if the king does what God wills. If Henry longs to be a humble swain, though, this too is denied him. Common men, as the plays repeatedly show us, are like sheep that follow whoever has the power, whereas Henry always seems to follow God. Yet in the end, Henry himself is the shepherd who becomes the sheep, guileless and sacrificial. Gloucester predicted as much in Part 2 when he was arrested for treason. Thus is the shepherd beaten from thy side, and wolves are gnarling who shall gnaw thee first. In the tower just before his death, Henry himself invokes this densely biblical imagery when he faces Richard, who's also Duke of Gloucester. We have this kind of balancing, right, between Dukes of Gloucester. The lieutenant protecting Henry leaves at Richard's command, and Henry says, so flies the reckless shepherd from the wolf, so first the harmless sheep doth yield his fleece, and next his throat unto the butcher's knife. The passage invokes Isaiah 53:6-8. the victim afflicted like a lamb that is led to the slaughter and stricken for the transgression of his people. Henry's ineptitude and distaste for power might reasonably be said to bring on the transgression of his people. That is, the horrors of the War of the Roses might have been avoided under stronger and more prudent rule. But in another interpretation, the unchosen task for which Henry proved himself so unfit was itself God's will. And Henry's noblest deed in Shakespeare's presentation of him is to endure it, to embody his people's suffering and fearlessly die on behalf of these sheep with their wavering loyalties. Everything about his piety, it seems to me, evokes the old faith. His death feels like martyrdom, and even beyond death, he defies sober Protestant expectation. His corpse bleeds in the presence of Richard, his murderer. Holinshed soberly records the fact. Shakespeare repeats it, and I suggest gives it a larger symbolic reverence. And no one in the plays challenges this miracle. Even Margaret cites it. So, it's of course possible to interpret Richard III without reading the Henry VI plays, but in doing so one loses, among many other things, this cardinal figure of the order that's passing away. In an essay from 1950, I had to bring in the South, all right, to bring this back to the South, called Why the Modern South Has a Great Literature. The Southern poet and critic Donald Davidson makes a startling comparison between William Shakespeare and William Faulkner. The South in the early decades of the 20th century, he argues, was a traditional society, much like England's in Shakespeare's day. A traditional society, he writes, is a society that is stable, religious, more rural than urban, and conservative. Family, blood kinship, folkways, custom, community in such a society supply the needs that in a non-traditional or progressive society are supplied at great cost by artificial devices like training schools and government agencies. Eamon Duffy's The Stripping of the Altars, invoked once again, illustrates in detail what traditional Catholicism in England looked like before Henry's reforms, as well as what had happened by the time of Shakespeare's youth. Davidson's point is that when major new forces disturb a traditional society, it can absorb, up to a certain point, what he calls, certainly with tongue-in-cheek, modern improvements, without losing its character. At that point, when the society is thrown a little out of balance, but not yet completely off balance, the moment of self-consciousness arrives. Then a process begins that at first is enormously stimulating, but that if it continues unchecked, may prove debilitating and destructive in the end. As examples, he cites Greece in the 5th century BC, Rome of the late Republic, Italy in Dante's time, England in the 16th century, in each of which changes threw them slightly out of balance without at first achieving cultural destruction. Davidson includes Sophocles and Shakespeare among those whom the changes force into an examination of their total inheritance that perhaps they would not otherwise have undertaken. They begin to compose literary works in which the whole metaphysic of the society suddenly takes dramatic or poetic or fictional form. Their glance is always retrospective, but their point of view is always thoroughly contemporary. The moment of self-consciousness, he writes, is the moment when a writer waits to realize that what he and his people truly are in comparison with what they are being urged to become. Now, in the first tetralogy, I suggest, and mostly in his concentration on Henry VI, Shakespeare reached that self-consciousness for the first time. He saw what England truly was, how it had changed, for better and for worse. He saw most clearly of all what it was being urged to become, whether in its Puritan or its Machiavellian forms, maybe in some mix, and his splendid commentary and I would say splendid resistance informed the whole of what he did thereafter. Time for questions.
A quick comment on the irony of sources. As you well know, and as we all know, Shakespeare's Richard III is closely based on Thomas More's history of Richard III, which was written to defend the regime of Henry VII, which overthrew the regime of Richard III, and therefore More blackened him and even made him demonic deliberately in order to vindicate Henry VII's overthrow of his predecessor, even though that is a very close parallel to Henry IV's overthrow of Richard II and so on. Another irony, you mentioned John Blackman and his history of Henry VI. Blackman wrote that at the behest of Henry VII and VIII because they were trying very hard to vindicate a member of the Lancastrian, their Parliament of York's predecessors, known as Lancastrian, in finding Henry as a saint. In fact, they were working very hard to beatify him, and that process came to a halt with Henry VIII's decision to leave the Church of Rome. So there's just amazing ironies here.
There are many ironies. It's interesting that Henry VI, in one of the passages that I didn't mention, after he's returned to the throne temporarily in Henry VI, Part 3, sees young Richmond when he's on the way to France for safekeeping, and says, "Oh, now there's a king." He says, "This one has promise, has a sort of aura around him of kingship and majesty. So keep your eye on him." So yeah, you get all these sorts of things going on in here. Thanks for pointing those out.
Just to follow up on Professor Cox's question, any more thoughts about the real or historical Henry VI? I've heard described as the greatest English Catholic saint that might have been. That his devotion to him exceeded by far devotion to Thomas Becket. Professor Cox referred to the canonization process. That great Henry VII chapel in Westminster Abbey was supposed to celebrate the canonization of Henry VI. And 10 years ago or so, I subscribed to a contemporary society in England for the promotion of the canonization of Henry VI. I don't know if that society still exists or not. Any thoughts about the real Henry VI?
Well, my thoughts are, I have to say, Dennis, more limited to the Henry VI that we see in the play. But the real Henry VI was considered a saint from the time of his death, right? And the fact that Shakespeare presents his corpse, in a miraculous light, it seems to me an underscoring of both popular belief and its own dramatic kind of validation of it. I don't know what you do to get around the problems that arise in thinking about Henry VI as both a king and a saint. In other words, is a saint as king necessarily as bad a king as Henry VI seems to have been? I know that there are historical accounts of his intermittent insanity, right, which he inherited from his grandfather, who used to think that he was made of glass on occasion. This is not a good way to feel, I think. But Henry VI as if we take all that really to heart, that would mean that this is Shakespeare's only depiction of a saint, right? Somebody who could legitimately be held up for canonization as a saint. I have to take that back because Joan of Arc is the other one, isn't she? And Edward the Confessor went there. That's right. Who has the healing touch. Yeah. Yes.
Well, on your last point about whether the king can be a saint, I think you have to compare Henry's life with something like St. Louis. Louis got rid of the fairly king honor.
When we see Henry trying to do something, he simply seems to have no taste for power. And I don't want to put that in a way that makes it sound like power is always bad, because it isn't, right? And if you're king, you need to exert it. You need to act as a king ought. And Henry lets Gloucester be taken away and imprisoned when it seems, when he acts with Suffolk. Granted, he does it with the Commons behind him, but he does it in a way that's swift and decisive. He banishes Suffolk and says, "You're still in England, 3 days, you're dead." With Gloucester, he seems too easily swayed by those around him to let him be taken off and killed, basically. Had he intervened, had he been stronger in Gloucester's defense, you have to think the just man would have been saved. There are just a lot of instances like that undercut a portrait of what you would really think of as a sort of ideal king saint. He's to put, I don't want to put this, he errs on the side of sainthood,
I wonder whether the whole idea of His Holiness is also part of a larger picture. I was thinking of that wonderful production which you mentioned in the 70s.
I wish I had seen it before. Did you see it?
Yes, I did. It was absolutely tremendous. What was particularly striking was that Henry was part of a larger picture. And I wonder whether it's His Holiness is in part an ironic comment on the corruption of the church as it's portrayed there, and particularly Winchester. I'm thinking really of Harrington's Sapphire edition of the Catalogue of Bishops, where Winchester is still remembered as he's the only character remembered with real passionate disdain by Harrington as a corrupt churchman, Stephen Gardiner, and whether the Winchester of these plays is actually being related to that, but certainly related to the whole idea of a church which has lost its grip. So the king has to be holy because the church isn't.
That's a very good point. I think that's almost Margaret's point, though. I mean, this seems to be what you're saying, that, if they want a good pope, then here's one, right? He would be an excellent pope because this man I have the misfortune to be married to is a saint. And that's sort of Margaret's take on it, if I'm not mistaken. But the church, as represented by Winchester, is sort of like the church as represented by Dante, or the church as represented by characters like the Cardinal, in Chaucer, or others like that, the friar. So there are those who abuse their offices, and they are truly, the villains of the piece. And so, so if the king has to be a saint, what is the state of things?
Excuse me. Glenn, I wonder if there's something inherently Catholic about Shakespeare's view of history as portrayed through the history plays, through the English history plays, but also in the Roman plays, which are tragedies. Your thoughts, please.
We'll say a little more. I'm not quite sure where you're going.
Well, in the tension between the secular regime and the spiritual. The city of God and the city of man.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say about what I think Shakespeare is depicting in the history plays. And if I had to say, in short, what it is, I think it's a movement it is a movement from traditional Catholicism to this new order of things, which is a kind of compromise with politics. I think his view is always opposed to the merely secular one. You know, what exactly a Catholic view of history is, I would need to think about more. I'm not quite sure what that means. If anybody else has a speculation, I'd love to hear it. But yeah.
I was, to carry on what you're saying, I was very struck by the end of your talk. I think it's Faulkner, who I think it was Faulkner who said we're never more conscious of our homeland than when it is passing away, which I had definitely implied. But I wonder whether there is something about the separation of the temporal and the spiritual, which it seems that Shakespeare and a lot of people at that time thought was a good idea. It was a bad idea for Henry, the temporal, to rape, to use Thomas More's words, the spiritual, and this dreadful rape by the crown of the church meant that for the past 70 years, England had been ruled by three ostensibly pious weaklings. So I wonder whether you think Henry VI could be a critique of piety ruling England instead of kingship, and that piety being effeminate, which of course Henry VI has always been accused of being, isn't he? He's effeminate, or a schoolboy and a child. And that is the nursery. To have a country ruled by pious women and children is the nursery of the monsters you've described so well, Winchester and Co, Gloucester, and the genesis.
That's a very interesting comment and question. I hadn't connected it to the role of women, you know, what that means, particularly in terms of piety. I had thought, frankly, that one of the implications of these plays was that the English themselves had not stood up for their traditional piety sufficiently, that they had let it happen to them. And that's one of the, it seems to me, the implicit critiques going on. I think that's what you meant by your trader's remarks in the previous talk. But I think Shakespeare always prefers robust, prudent kingship. You know, the action that needs to be taken, not in a Machiavellian way, but in a way that sees the truth of things and acts prudently on it. And I'm not sure that your first consideration as king is, well, it's dangerous territory, right? Is your first thought as king what the church wants you to do? I mean, Gloucester's comments that you see at the beginning of Henry VI, Part 1, are directly to that. You know, what the church wants is an effeminate prince who can tell what to do. You want a godly king who's got some kind of Old Testament tang to it.
Just to follow on from that, would you see Edward III as the model there?
I mean, Edward III seems to be everybody's favorite.
Right? He didn't rape the woman,
Right.
He held back. Yeah. Would that be a corollary?
That's interesting.
Next question to Father Gregory Morgan.
Just to add a comment to what you just said, it reminds me of, in a sense, how Dante approaches this, where the best rulers in Dante are stuck outside of purgatory because they spent their time ruling rather than worrying about their spiritual lives.
Right, and they're out there in the valley of the rulers, sort of waiting to get into purgatory proper. So how long does it take to get a ruler into purgatory?
As long as he ruled it out.
Right. There was one of my colleagues at Thomas More College, where Taylor and I were, used to talk about this early tract in the church, can a bishop be saved? You sort of see the problem. If you do what's necessary in terms of rule, you're having to do some harsh things. And I think Shakespeare's always aware of that. Well, thank you very much.
fundamental question, did Shakespeare really write the three parts of Henry VI? Because the first thing we know about Shakespeare, the first, let's say, recorded instance of Shakespeare's presence in London comes from the pen of Robert Greene, who accuses him of being an upstart crow dressed in borrowed feathers.
Right.
And presumably the borrowed feathers are those from the university wits who were not so favourably disposed towards the Catholic Church, including Marlowe and Greene himself. And so this would apply especially to the three parts of Henry VI, because these were plays written by a newcomer to the London stage, maybe to some extent Richard III too, the extent to which Christopher Marlowe may have had a hand in these plays. And then when we go to the end, it's so obvious that Henry VIII is only partly written by Shakespeare. And this is the point of view of my good friend Thomas Merriam, who's written two monographs, one on King John and one on Henry VIII, minimizing Shakespeare's collaboration. And in a recent article for a Renaissance Bulletin, he mentioned Henry, part of the place of Joan of Arc in Henry VI, Part 1. So he follows a certain method called stylometrics, which I can't understand. He seems to be rather convincing, not that Shakespeare has nothing to do with these plays, but Shakespeare is brought in to complete what had already been handed to the one or other of the university wits. How would you answer that?
Well, I think you get into many difficulties that may be necessary difficulties, obviously, but and they occupy many scholars in the 19th century as well. You know, who wrote which parts of these early plays? So this 1917 essay to which I referred goes through Henry VI Part 1 in some detail, you know, sort of parsing out which parts he thought were written by Shakespeare and which weren't. And his principle was that you look for the continuities. You know, let's say that Shakespeare was the masterful reviser and editor of the plays. He comes in and makes a whole out of what are perhaps effective dramatically but disparate parts, you know, in the trilogy, and makes it this intact thing that I think it really feels like when you see it or you hear it. The Joan of Arc sections, I would dearly love to find out Shakespeare did not write. But they do seem to be accepted as part of the play, right, by Shakespeare's own contemporaries, you know, who published the first folio. And if Shakespeare accepts them as his own, then what do we do with it? That becomes the question, it seems to me. What do we do with the completed play that we have, which is what we have, and how do we try to understand it as a work of art, given all the pieces that are in it? If you didn't write them, you let them stay. Let's put it that way. And having done so, try to make them fit into a larger picture. What I would say about Joan of Arc is this. I know that Claire Asquith has interpreted Joan of Arc as a kind of Lutheran figure. I'd like to believe that too. I'm not sure an audience that would be the first thing that came to mind, but I don't know. The figure of someone who gives up everything for the nation seems to be the point with her. She truly loves France. That's never in question. She is so much in love with France that she's willing to die at the end and give her soul to these fiends for France. Now, is that a kind of premonition, say, of some kind of thematic embedding of the kind of putting the nation before everything that we see as a problem later in these history books? I don't know. But at least it's a take on it. So with that uncertain answer,